There is a particular kind of intelligence that does not show up on any examination. It cannot be measured or awarded or hung in a frame on a wall. It lives in the eyes, mostly, in the way a person enters a room and immediately, without appearing to look at anyone, has already assessed everyone in it, has already decided who has money, who wants to feel important, who is lonely, who is greedy, and, most critically, who is all for at once. Victor Lustig had this intelligence in a quantity that by any reasonable measure bordered on the supernatural. He was, depending on who you asked and when you asked them, a count, a baron, a government minister, a Swiss banker, a Broadway producer, and a personal friend of the president. He spoke 5 languages without an accent in any of them. He dressed like a man who had never once considered the price of anything. And in a career that spanned 3 decades and 2 continents, he committed crimes so audacious, so staggering in their sheer nerve, that even the agents who eventually caught him could not quite bring themselves to be angry. One Secret Service agent asked to describe him chose these words: elusive as a puff of cigarette smoke, and as charming as a young girl's dream. He sold the Eiffel Tower twice. He swindled Al Capone out of $50,000 and left the encounter with Capone's gratitude. He escaped from a maximum security federal prison using a rope made from bed sheets, walked out into a Manhattan morning pretending to be a window cleaner, and vanished into the crowd for 27 days. His real name was Robert Miller, but nobody called him that, not even, eventually, himself. This is the story of the Count. He was born in 1890 in a small town in Bohemia called Hostine, at the time part of the sprawling Austro-Hungarian Empire. His father was a mayor. His family was respectable, Catholic, solidly middle class, the kind of family that produced doctors and lawyers and civil servants, men who wore their names quietly and built things that lasted. Victor was different from the beginning. He was brilliant in the way that occasionally produces something very useful and occasionally produces something else entirely. As a child, he was charming to the point of unnerving, the kind of child who could talk his way out of any punishment and into any confidence, who seemed to understand instinctively that the world operated not on rules but on perception, that if you look like a person who belongs somewhere, no one would ever ask whether you did. He studied in Paris as a young man. Languages came to him the way music comes to some people, effortlessly, completely, with the natural authority of a native. French, German, English, Italian. He collected them the way other men collected debts. And in Paris, he discovered something else: gambling. Not the reckless gambling of a man looking for excitement, the precise, patient gambling of a man who has understood that most games are not really about luck at all. They are about reading people, about watching a hand hover over a card and knowing, from the angle of a shoulder, which way it will go. By 19, he had abandoned formal education entirely. He had also acquired, somewhere along the way, a distinctive scar along his left cheek, the result, by most accounts, of a jealous lover who had considerably better aim than he had expected. He wore the scar well. Everything about Victor Lustig he wore well. He left Bohemia in 1909 and never went back. He was 19 years old. He had no money, no credentials, and no plan beyond a general conviction that the world contained a great deal of wealth and that much of it was, under the right circumstances, accessible to a man with his particular set of gifts. He was not wrong. He began, as many con men do, small. Pickpocketing, minor card swindles in Viennese cafes, the kind of work that keeps a man fed without ever making him rich. He was good at it, better than good, but he understood that the real money was not in small rooms with small men. The real money was in rooms where the small men did not get in. Transatlantic ocean liners. In the early 1900s, the great steamships crossing between Europe and America were floating worlds unto themselves. They were packed with wealthy passengers who had nothing to do for a week but eat, drink, socialize, and, critically, invest. First class on a transatlantic liner in 1910 was a contained ecosystem of money, boredom, and social ambition. Everything Victor Lustig had been born to exploit. He dressed for the part. He always dressed for the part. A slim-fitting suit, a carefully cultivated air of old European money, a title that shifted depending on the company. Count Lustig in one conversation, Baron von Lustig in another. The key he had discovered was not the specific title. It was the certainty with which you wore it. People do not question a man who does not appear to expect to be questioned. On the liners, he ran a simple operation. He would identify wealthy passengers, specifically wealthy passengers who were also vain and bored and nursing the quiet anxiety of men who had made their money recently and had not yet learned how to be comfortable with it. He would befriend them, genuinely befriend them, in the way that only very skilled manipulators can, making the target feel that they had been specifically chosen, that this elegant, cultured European man found them uniquely interesting among the entire ship. And then, after days of careful cultivation, he would mention, almost as an afterthought, a theatrical investment, a Broadway production, a sure thing. Men who needed to feel they were in on something would hand over thousands without blinking. He was arrested in several countries during these years, questioned in at least 5. It made very little impression on him. By the time World War I ended and the 1920s began to open up like a flower, Victor Lustig had refined his craft to something close to an art form. He had also developed what he called his own personal code of conduct. 11 commandments he followed without exception. Be a patient listener, never look bored, wait for the other person to reveal their greed, never discuss your personal life, never boast, never get drunk, and above everything else, make your target feel smarter than you. That last one was the master key, the one that opened everything else. He returned to Paris in 1925. He was 35 years old, impeccably dressed, and in possession of a criminal record in multiple countries that had somehow never managed to slow him down. One morning, over coffee at a hotel on the Rue de Rivoli, he was reading a newspaper. A small item on an inside page. The Eiffel Tower, the article noted, had fallen into considerable disrepair. The cost of maintaining it was enormous. The government was said to be quietly exploring its options. Victor Lustig put down his coffee. He read the article again. And then he had an idea so large, so breathtakingly, almost incomprehensibly bold, that a lesser man would have dismissed it as a fantasy and moved on. Victor Lustig was not a lesser man. He spent the next week preparing. He had stationery printed on official-looking government letterhead. He arranged to use a suite at the Hôtel de Crillon, one of the grandest hotels in Paris, the kind of address that communicated, without a single word needing to be spoken, that whoever was staying there was not someone to be doubted. He then sent private, confidential letters to 6 of Paris's most prominent scrap metal dealers. The letters informed them, on behalf of the French Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs, that they had been selected, confidentially and before any public announcement, to submit bids for a significant government contract. The Eiffel Tower, the letters explained, was to be demolished and sold for scrap. The dealers arrived at the Crillon in a government car that Victor had arranged. He greeted them in the lobby wearing a suit that cost more than most of them earned in a month, flanked by an associate playing the role of his secretary. He shook each man's hand with the warm, measured confidence of a senior official who was doing them a favor by including them. Over a private lunch, he laid out the situation. The tower, he explained gravely, had become a burden. Maintenance costs were unsustainable. The government had made the decision quietly to avoid public sentiment. The men in this room had been chosen because of their discretion and their capability. The bid process would be handled privately, and above all, he impressed upon them, absolute silence was required until the contract was signed. He was asking them, in other words, to keep a secret, and nothing makes a man feel more important than being trusted with one. Among the 6 dealers, one stood out. His name was André Poisson. He was newly wealthy, the most dangerous kind of mark in Victor's experience. Newly wealthy men have 2 qualities that make them exceptionally easy to manipulate. They have money, and they have something to prove. Poisson wanted desperately to be taken seriously, to be seen as the kind of man who moved in important circles, to have a story that would make other men lean forward at dinner. Victor saw all of this in the first 30 seconds. Over the following days, he cultivated Poisson with surgical precision. Private meetings, confidential updates. The suggestion, never stated outright, always implied that Poisson was the front runner, that the others were merely going through the motions, that this deal, this extraordinary deal, was really meant for him. And then came the moment that nearly ended everything. Poisson's wife was suspicious. She had watched her husband come home flushed and excited from these meetings, talking about a government contract, a private deal, a ministry official who had personally selected him. She had listened to all of it and felt, somewhere in her chest, the particular coldness of a woman who has not survived the world by ignoring her instincts. She told Poisson she wanted answers, specific ones, about this minister, about his credentials, about why this deal was happening in a hotel suite rather than a government office. Poisson came to Victor with these questions, nervously, apologetically, the way a man apologizes for his wife's doubt as though it were an embarrassment rather than good sense. Victor did not miss a beat. He looked at Poisson for a long moment, and then, with the expression of a man making a difficult decision, he leaned forward. He confided something, quietly, man to man. The truth, he said, was that government salaries were, well, Poisson was a man of the world. He understood how these things worked. The minister responsible for this contract had certain expectations. A private arrangement, naturally, handled discreetly, separate from the official process. He was asking for a bribe, and in doing so, he had turned Poisson's suspicion into relief, because a corrupt official made sense. A corrupt official was something Poisson knew how to understand. Corruption was real. Corruption happened. But an elaborate fiction constructed by a stranger just to steal his money? That was the kind of thing that happened to other people. Poisson paid the bribe gladly, and then he paid for the tower. The exact figure has never been confirmed. Poisson was far too humiliated to ever make the full details public, but it was substantial. Hundreds of thousands of francs, handed over in exchange for paperwork that looked official and meant nothing. That same evening, Victor Lustig and his associate boarded a train to Vienna. By the time André Poisson walked into a government office to begin processing his ownership of the Eiffel Tower, there was no trace of the man who had sold it to him. No suite at the Crillon, no ministry official, no contract, nothing. Poisson never went to the police. The shame of it, the sheer, devastating shame of having been so thoroughly, so completely deceived, was more than he could face publicly. He absorbed the loss in private and told no one. Victor Lustig, reading the Paris newspapers from Vienna and finding no mention of himself anywhere, drew the only reasonable conclusion available to a man of his particular disposition. He decided to do it again. He returned to Paris. He gathered another 6 scrap metal dealers, another suite, another government car, another private lunch with another set of confidential letters on government stationery. The second Eiffel Tower sale proceeded almost identically to the first. There was a chosen mark. There was a period of careful cultivation. There was the transaction. But this time, something was different. This mark went to the police. Victor found out with approximately 4 hours to spare. He and his associate were on the next available transport out of France, using 2 of the dozens of false passports he kept for precisely this kind of situation. By the time investigators arrived at the Hotel de Crillon, the suite was empty, the stationery was gone, and the man who had sold the Eiffel Tower twice was already crossing the Atlantic. He was never charged in France. He was never charged anywhere in connection with either Eiffel Tower sale. The first victim was too humiliated to speak. The second had spoken, but by then there was no one left to charge. The man who sold the Eiffel Tower twice paid no legal price for it whatsoever. He arrived in America, and if Europe had thought it had seen the best of him, America was about to learn otherwise. Sigh softly. Calm. Before we get to what happened in America, and what happened there is extraordinary. If this is the kind of story you like to wind down with, consider subscribing. New stories every week, and drop a comment below with your favorite part of this story so far, or a story you would like to hear next. This channel is shaped by the people who listen. Pause, calm now. Back to Victor Lustig and Al Capone. America in the 1920s was precisely the environment Victor Lustig had been designed by nature to inhabit. It was a country in the grip of 2 powerful and contradictory forces: enormous new wealth and enormous new anxiety about that wealth. Men who had made fortunes in a decade and were terrified of losing them in a month. Men who needed to believe that somewhere, somehow, there was an edge available to the right person. Victor gave them an edge. He called it the Romanian money box. It was a small, unremarkable-looking device, a wooden box with an arrangement of dials and rollers on the front. To look at it, you would think it was nothing. A curiosity, a piece of amateur engineering. Victor would explain, with the patient authority of a man sharing something most people were not qualified to understand, that the box worked on a radium-based process of chemical replication. Given a genuine banknote in 6 hours, it would produce a perfect duplicate. He would demonstrate. He would take a $100 bill from the mark, feed it into one end of the box, and then, crucially, make them wait. 6 hours. He was very specific about the 6 hours. It had to be exactly 6 hours. The radium process required it. 6 hours later, the box would produce 2 bills, both genuine because Victor had preloaded the second one before the demonstration began. The mark held 2 real $100 bills in their hands. They had watched the machine produce one from another with their own eyes, their own hands. There was nothing to doubt. The price of the machine was $30,000. People paid it. One of his marks, a Texas sheriff of all people, eventually realized he had been deceived and tracked Victor down to Chicago. He confronted him directly. It was the kind of confrontation that ended badly for most people. Victor listened to the sheriff's anger patiently, and then he told him with great sincerity that the problem was operator error, that the sheriff had clearly not followed the instructions correctly, that the machine was, in fact, working perfectly, but these things required precision, and if the sheriff had deviated even slightly from the process, the results would be corrupted. The sheriff left convinced he had made a mistake. Victor, as a gesture of goodwill, gave him some cash for the inconvenience. The cash was counterfeit. The sheriff was later arrested in New Orleans for passing fake bills. There are risks, and then there are things so far beyond risk that they require an entirely different category of description. What Victor Lustig did next falls into the second category. He decided to con Al Capone. Al Capone in 1930 was not merely a criminal, he was an institution. He controlled Chicago with a combination of money, violence, and political connection that made him effectively untouchable. He had people killed for inconveniences far smaller than being swindled. The idea of approaching him with a fraudulent investment scheme was not simply dangerous, It was, by any rational assessment, suicidal. Victor understood this completely and approached him anyway. The scheme he presented to Capone was a stock investment. A sure thing, he explained, with the understated confidence of a man who did not need to oversell anything because the facts spoke for themselves. He needed $50,000 to make it work. The returns would be substantial. Capone famously handed over the $50,000. Victor put it in a safe deposit box and left it there for 2 months. Then he returned to Capone, sat across from the most dangerous man in America, and told him, with what can only be described as extraordinary composure, that the investment had fallen through, that the opportunity had not materialized as expected, and he handed back every dollar. Capone stared at him. In 30 years of criminal enterprise, no one had ever returned his money. No one had ever been in a position to return it because no one had ever been honest with him about a loss. Every associate, every partner, every man who had ever held Capone's money had found a way to make it disappear with a plausible excuse. Here was a man sitting across from him who had lost his investment and come back to make him whole. Capone was moved. He trusted Victor completely, and when Victor explained, with great humility, that he found himself temporarily short of funds after the failed venture, could Capone possibly help him out? Just to tide him over? Capone handed him $5,000 without hesitation. Victor had never invested anything. The original $50,000 had sat in a deposit box for 2 months. He had paid back Capone's money with Capone's money and collected a $5,000 tip for doing it. He had just conned Al Capone. And Capone never knew. Later, much later, when both men eventually found themselves as inmates at Alcatraz, Capone would actually extend his protection to Victor, the most feared man in the prison, looking out for the man who had stolen from him and whom he still believed to be the most honest person he had ever done business with. Even in prison, Victor Lustig was still running the con. By 1930, Victor Lustig had accumulated 38 arrests across his career. 38. In multiple countries, under multiple names, and he had walked away from every single one of them. He had also begun what would become his most ambitious operation yet. Not a single con, not one elegant deception, but a manufacturing enterprise. A counterfeiting ring so sophisticated that the bills it produced were nearly indistinguishable from genuine currency. His partner was a pharmacist named William Watts, who had somehow developed the technical skill to produce printing plates of extraordinary quality. Victor handled everything else: the distribution, the network, the sales. Within 5 years, more than $2.5 million worth of what the Secret Service came to call Lustig money had circulated through the American economy. Federal agents knew someone was behind it. They could feel the operation's scale and the quality of the bills, in the reach of the network. But Victor was careful and protected and very, very hard to find. What they could not have anticipated was that his downfall would come not from their investigation, but from his love life. His mistress was a woman named Billie Mae Scheibel. She ran a brothel in Pittsburgh and was, by all accounts, not a woman to be trifled with. When she discovered that Victor had begun a parallel relationship with a younger woman, the mistress of one of his own partners, she did not confront him. She did not make a scene. She made a phone call, an anonymous one, to the FBI. On the evening of May 10, 1935, Victor Lustig was walking down Broadway in New York, elegantly dressed as always, a Chesterfield coat, his characteristic scar visible on his cheek. A plainclothes agent who had been briefed on the scar spotted him from across the street. A circle of agents closed around him. One of them found a key in his coat pocket, a small, unremarkable key, the kind you might carry for a storage locker. The agents traced it to a locker in the Times Square subway station. Inside, they found $51,000 in counterfeit bills, and the printing plates that had made them. After 38 arrests, after 2 Eiffel Tower sales, after Al Capone and the Romanian box, and 5 languages and 4 dozen aliases, and a career that had defied every attempt to end it, Victor Lustig was finally going to trial. Or so they thought. The Federal House of Detention in Lower Manhattan was known, informally, as the Tombs. It was connected directly to the courthouse by a walkway. It was considered secure. It was, by the standards of 1935 American law enforcement, escape-proof. Victor was held there awaiting trial. On the Sunday before Labor Day 1935, one day before his trial was scheduled to begin, Victor Lustig tore his bed sheets into strips and fashioned them into a rope. He worked through the bars on his window. He then climbed out of a federal detention facility in Lower Manhattan in broad daylight and shimmied down the outside of the building. Pretending to be a window cleaner, he disappeared into the crowd on the street below and simply walked away. The Secret Service were, understandably, beside themselves. The manhunt that followed was extensive. 27 days later, they found him in Pittsburgh, almost certainly through the same informant network that had caught him the first time. He was returned to custody, tried, and on December 5, 1935, sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. The judge, reportedly, was not lenient. He was sent to Alcatraz. He arrived at the Rock as prisoner number 300. Among the other inmates was Al Capone, serving time for tax evasion. Capone, upon seeing his old friend and trusting him still, extended his protection. The most feared man in Alcatraz, guarding the man who had stolen from him without his knowledge. Over the following years, Victor's health declined steadily. Prison had very little to offer a man whose every gift depended on movement, on space, on the ability to be someone different tomorrow than he was today. On March 11, 1947, Victor Lustig died of pneumonia in a federal prison hospital in Springfield, Missouri. He was 56 years old. His death certificate listed his occupation: apprentice salesman. Somewhere, in whatever exists after this, Victor Lustig was almost certainly smiling at that. Victor Lustig left behind very little in the conventional sense. No fortune. It had been spent, hidden, or confiscated. No family to speak of publicly, no legacy built on anything that would survive the light of day. What he did leave behind was something stranger and more durable. He left behind the 10 Commandments for con men, a set of rules he reportedly composed himself, circulated among the criminal underworld, and which read, if you strip away the context, less like instructions for fraud and more like a masterclass in human nature. Be patient. Be a good listener. Never appear to want anything. Let the other person reveal their greed. Make them feel smarter than you. They are, if you read them carefully, instructions for charm, for the kind of social intelligence that most people spend their entire lives trying to develop and never quite manage. Victor Lustig had it completely and naturally and used it to take people's money, which is one way to use it. Not perhaps the most admirable, but undeniably the most interesting. The Eiffel Tower still stands beautifully, in fact, fully restored, lovingly maintained, visited by millions of people every year who have no idea that once, in 1925, a man in a slim-fitting suit sat down to a private lunch at the Hôtel de Crillon and sold it. Twice. André Poisson never spoke publicly about what happened to him. The second victim went to the police and found no one to charge. And Victor Lustig boarded a boat and crossed an ocean and started again. That was the story of Victor Lustig, the Count, the man who sold the Eiffel Tower twice, swindled Al Capone, escaped from a federal prison using bedsheets, and spent 56 years being the most interesting person in every room he ever entered. If you made it this far tonight, thank you. Subscribe if you would like more stories like this one, new ones every week. and leave a comment. Who would you like to hear about next? A forgotten figure? A cold case? A chapter of history nobody talks about anymore? This channel belongs to the people who listen. Sleep well.